I'm Rachel Vogel, Vice President of Programs for the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Voting for president using the Electoral College has been a part of American history since the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Debate surrounding the relevance of the Electoral College gained new ground since the results of the 2016 presidential election. However, this is not a new discussion. Since the early 19th century, roughly 900 constitutional amendments have been introduced in Congress to alter or abolish the Electoral College. Here today to weigh in on the pros and cons of the system are two Electoral College scholars, Jeffrey Engel and Tara Ross. Before we begin, please remember to pick up your copies of the books from our authors today, Let the People Pick the President and Why Do We Need the Electoral College, on Tara Bing's online store, and you can use the code dfwworld to receive 10% off. I would also like to thank the Center for Presidential History at SMU for being our promotional partner for today's program. And moderating today's program is a good friend of the council and the founding director of the Center for Presidential History, Jeffrey Engel. Jeff is also a professor in the Clements Department of History at SMU. He has authored or edited 12 books on American foreign policy and is currently writing Thinking About Tomorrow, the 1992 race for the White House that defined our times. If you don't recognize him from walking around SMU, you may recognize him as a media contributor on international and political affairs on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, NPR, and the BBC. Jeff, thank you for moderating today's program, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. Good to see everybody. It occurs to me that if you don't recognize me, it's probably because I should be wearing a mask, but I'm by myself in the office, so I'm conforming with proper policies. Thank you to the World Affairs Council for giving us this opportunity to discuss something that, of course, is going to be, I think, extraordinarily relevant in the next couple of months. Now, the question that we're going to be discussing today in part is exactly how relevant it's going to be. One interesting factoid to sort of get the conversation going before I introduce the guests. You may have seen that Nate Silver put out his latest, first actually, full-scale model of the election just yesterday. A couple interesting takeaways, including the fact that his model predicts that Joe Biden has a 71% chance of winning the Electoral College and an 85% chance of winning the popular vote. The fact that those two numbers are different, I think, is going to be a big part of our conversation today. And we have really wonderful people here to tell us what we should be thinking about this issue. We really could not find better national representatives of both sides of the Electoral College discussion. Let me begin with Tara Ross. She is a native Texan, graduate of Rice University. She also received her JD from the University of Texas Law School. She's recognized nationwide for her legal expertise in legal writing, and specifically, of course, on the Electoral College, where she's published several works. She's delivered remarks across the country and has appeared in the in the NPR and in USA Today. And in addition to doing 6 books, she also manages to have a family here in Dallas as well. So it's good to have someone local. I presume your air conditioning is on like the rest of us. And then on the opposite side of the discussion, if you will, is Jeffrey Wegman, who has long been involved in the journalistic world and also law. He's previously held positions at NPR and the New York Observer, among others. He is also a lawyer, a graduate of NYU Law School. And he's currently a member of the New York Times editorial board, focusing his work on legal writing. And we've asked each of these two marvelous guests to give us just a few minutes sort of laying out their basic position. And I'm going to try to respect chivalry, I guess, and offer Tara the first go. What we're going to do is have everybody give a couple of minutes of their position. We'll have some discussion. We'll let the our I don't want to say debaters, that's a little bit too harsh, our discussants perhaps query each other, and then we'll open up to questions from the broader audience. Tara, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Jeff. I'm happy to be here today. This discussion, of course, was going to occur last March or April, I guess, and then we got out pandemic or something. So I'm glad to be here today, and I thought I would use my time to talk about some of the myths that surround the Electoral College. There are quite a few of them. One of the myths that surrounds the Electoral College is that people think that it was created because of poor travel in the 1700s or poor communication, or you'll hear people say things like, well, the founders were just a bunch of elitists and they didn't trust the people. And so they created the Electoral College to take the election out of the hands of the people themselves. None of these things are true. The reason that the founders created the Electoral College was because they were students of history. They knew the history of past failed democracies, and they knew what had caused those democracies to implode. They knew that in a simple democracy, a bare or emotional majority can tyrannize even very large minority groups. And so they wanted to create something better than that. The other thing that they knew was they knew their own history, which we have forgotten some of this early history, but they had of course just come off a war for self-governance. They didn't have a seat at the table of parliament. They wanted that. They wanted to have a say in what was going on in their own lives. But they knew something else, and this is the part that we've forgotten. They knew that even if they had been given a seat at the table in parliament, they would have been outvoted time and time again by the majority of citizens at home in England. They still would have been tyrannized, even with that seat at the table. They knew our modern example of that dynamic is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner is not a just system. They felt that and they lived that, and they had to figure out how to balance these competing objectives. How do you create a society that is self-governing, that respects the right of the people to govern themselves, even as you protect minority groups from being tyrannized? So they solved their problem by creating a system of checks and balances. Of course, we have a Senate with one state, one vote representation. We have a House with one person, one vote representation. We have supermajority requirements to do things like amend the Constitution. We have presidential vetoes. We also have an electoral college. And these are tools that the founders gave us to protect against this dynamic of tyranny by the majority. Now I'm gonna add one last thing that the founders remembered that we don't think about often enough. They knew that humans are flawed. They knew that power corrupts. They knew that even the best of people can be in power for too long and abuse it or just forget, like they become ungrounded. And in fact, there's a historian named Carol Burkin who speaks of this, and it's beautiful what she says about it. She says, they sat in the hall. Those men, those delegates to the Constitutional Convention were the most likely men, they were all men, to be senators or presidents in the first Congress. And so they sat there and they didn't even trust themselves. They debated how to put checks and balances on themselves because they knew they could fall prey to this corruption of power. So look, they at the end of the day, the founders did not trust anybody. So it's not fair to say they were just simply elitists who didn't trust the people. They didn't trust the federal government. They didn't trust the state governments. They didn't trust the executive. They didn't trust the legislature, the judiciary. They didn't trust the people, and they didn't trust elected officials. At the end of the day, they trusted absolutely no one, and they believed checks and balances was the only way forward. Now, the Electoral College that they've given us has served us well through the centuries. It encourages coalition building, and it keeps extremists like George Wallace in 1968 from gaining too much power. It prevents voter fraud, or at least hinders it. And I know that as I'm saying this, you guys are looking at me saying, this coalition building, huh, Tara? These are crazy times. So I'll wrap up by just saying what I've been saying, is that we are in a period of time like that after the Civil War. Back then too, we were divided, we were angry. We had elections where there was a discrepancy between the electoral vote and the popular vote. And over time, that had to be fixed. That North-South divide could not persist in the face of institutions like the Electoral College that require coalition building. And so I would argue that, yeah, this is an ugly time. We are angry, we are divided. Nobody's doing a good job of coalition building, but the Electoral College incentivizes that. And the first party to figure that out will start winning in electoral landslides. And we can stop talking about the possibility of these discrepancies between the electoral and popular vote. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks for your time.
Tara, thank you. That was wonderful. I really appreciate your bringing us back to the image of the founders as they're writing the Constitution. It makes me recall something that my old college advisor used to point out, that the Constitutional Convention was the only time in American history when the political elite and the intellectual elite were the same people. We've divided those ever since. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my advisor, who I miss dearly. Without any further ado, Jesse, please tell us your side.
Thanks, Jeff, and it's great to be here with you and Tara, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for hosting this event. As Tara says, we were all looking forward to doing this in person about 3 or 4 months ago. It was another world then. And I'm glad we can do it here, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy as can be in these circumstances. So I will begin by agreeing with Tara about one key point, which is I think, as she very nicely put it, the founders' understanding of human fallibility, and not just of humans in general, but of themselves and of all people in power, especially their fallibility, their liability toward corruption, and the desire for permanent hold on power. All of that, I think, is true. I think in that way they were quite prescient, and they were very savvy people about the human nature and how it interacted with political systems. I think I'm going to disagree on most everything else that she said, both in terms of the history of the Electoral College and the reasons for its creation, and also the way that it functions today. And those are really my two main points that I wanted to make, and I think they probably are the two main points of our disagreement. So I'll quickly summarize where I disagree with Tara on those, and then I think the conversation can kind of build out from there, and we focus on what other questions you have, Jeff, or what comes from the audience. But I will say this: I guess I'm not sure. I think we could all point to different parts of that constitutional convention, to quotes from the different framers at the convention in Philadelphia in that summer of 1787. But I do think it's unquestionably clear that the framers, first of all, did understand that, I don't think it's at all a myth that the framers understood that there were limitations on what the public could reasonably be could be trusted to know about national political candidates. This was at a time, obviously, when there was no communications network, there was no transportation network, people didn't travel far from home, and the framers, they knew this. Now, that didn't mean they didn't trust the people. In fact, they gave a direct vote to the eligible voters in the country for the House of Representatives, which they believed would be the most powerful and influential branch of the federal government. They didn't have trouble giving them that vote. There was no argument over that. The concern was when you expanded the sphere of jurisdiction to include the entire country, that most people would not possibly know about candidates who didn't live in their immediate vicinity. In other words, the people they would be voting for members of the House. So this was one way to deal with that. I'm not saying it was the only factor involved in choosing an electoral college. The point I want to make about how the Electoral College was actually adopted at the convention, and this is again, I think, in contrast to what Tara is arguing, is that I think all the available evidence suggests that it was essentially a jerry-rigged, last-minute decision that the framers made at the very end of the convention. They had fought over this more than any other topic at the convention. They were arguing over it from virtually the first week until the very end. It was in the first week of September, after 4 months of dealing with all kinds of other issues as well, that they finally got a few of the delegates together in a side room of the convention hall and hammered out what turned out to be the longest and most convoluted provision in the entire Constitution, which was what we now call the Electoral College. They didn't call it that. And it was like so much else in the Constitution, a compromise among competing ideas of how you elect the leader of a self-governing republic. Remember, no one had ever done this before. Tara is absolutely right that the founders were students of history. They had been trained in the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment in particular, informed many of their views about human nature and about political systems. But nobody had actually built up a self-governing republic before. And so they understood that, obviously they didn't want the monarchical system that they had just fought a war to get out from under. And they wanted a system in which you could have leaders who were representatives of the people, but also very accountable to them. So they established this system that we call the Electoral College today as a way to kind of broker a bunch of different compromises, which we can get into later. But I really think what's crucial to remember is the system that they designed in 1787 stopped working as they intended it to work almost immediately. They adopted it at the end there because they knew that whatever system they adopted, George Washington was going to be elected president. It really didn't matter. And so in a sense, this was almost a placeholder system. It was not, I argue, and I think the historical evidence backs up, it was not the carefully considered product of a brilliant constitutional design. It was a last minute, basically addendum to the Constitution. James Madison himself says this afterward. He says, basically, yeah, we were rushing at that point. We were tired and we did what we could do. In the years after the Constitutional Convention, that system fell apart because with the rise of national political parties, it was no longer an idea that there would be these, this body of independent men, this sort of this Platonic ideal of you know, country before party, you know, all of this notion that the framers were hawking at in the months after the passage of the signing of the Constitution. But in fact, it was really just two parties now fighting against each other and each one wanting their candidate in office. That's how it was in 1796, which is only 9 years after the Constitutional Convention, and it's how it is today. You know, electors, presidential electors, are not people who care about you know, who's best for the country, who's most, you know, sort of knowledgeable, and who would be the best leader. They care about their party winning. And that goes for both Democrats and Republicans. And I think that is how the Electoral College quickly started to operate with the rise of political parties, and it's how it operates today. So it really kind of, I think, undermines that argument that the framers knew what they were doing. They didn't really know what they were doing. They were doing the best they could. I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying they got a lot of things right in the Constitution. They got a lot of things wrong. I think they got this wrong, and I think many of them came to see that fairly quickly. I'll just give one example before I wrap up here, which is that James Madison, he lived longer than any other framer. He lived 50 years after the Constitutional Convention. So he got to see his ideas play out in practice. He got to see these theories of political representation and political function play out in practice. And he was pretty horrified by what he saw happening at the level of the presidential election. And I'm going to refer specifically here to the winner-take-all rules. These are the state rules that are nowhere in the Constitution. It's purely up to the states to decide how to award their electoral votes to one candidate or the other. Very quickly, the states shifted into doing it winner-take-all, which is what it sounds like. Whichever candidate wins the most votes in that state, the state gives that candidate all of its electors. Doesn't matter if the difference is 1 vote or 100 votes or 1,000,000 votes, they got all of the electors. And that, James Madison understood back in 1823 how corrosive that was. He actually proposed a constitutional amendment barring the practice of winner-take-all. It obviously didn't pass, and today we are still stuck with the winner-take-all system, which I would argue is the fundamental flaw in the existing Electoral College. And I do think that, you know, among the solutions that we can talk about today are ways to remove the winner-take-all system, even if we are not amending the Electoral College out of the Constitution. So just to wrap up, I'll say the framers understood at the beginning that, in fact, to the contrary of what I think Tara has argued, that majority rule is the essence of Republican government. They say it literally. They say the will of the majority is the essence of Republican government. They believed in majority rule. They believe in it. We believe in it for every single election that we hold in the country. I think all Americans in their heart believe that the person who wins the most votes in a representative democracy should be the winner of the election, and yet we don't run the biggest election and the most consequential election in our country that way. I think that needs to change, and I think we need to elect the president by a popular vote.
Thank you, Jesse. There's certainly a lot there to chew over. What I'm going to do first is remind everyone who's watching that we do have a Q&A box. Please put your questions in there, and they will be rank ordered. So if you like someone else's question, you can approve of it. It'll move up the list and more likely to get asked then. And I'm going to actually put a question to both of you, Tara and Jesse. And I'm going to ask the same question. This time I'm going to flip the order. So Jesse, you're up first, which is, neither of you mentioned the word slavery. And historians have debated, in fact, I think the historical interpretation of this has actually gone back and forth again, over how much a role slavery played. Obviously, it was critical to the formation of the Constitution itself, but of the Electoral College itself. And I was hoping that you could speak to that issue, because certainly I think we would have been discussing this issue in March, no doubt, but in the last couple of months, the issue of minority representation has, of course, become even more salient. So, Jesse, where is the history of slavery in here, and does that affect your argument in any particular way?
I appreciate you bringing that up, Jeff. Thank you. And I should have raised it. I was remiss not to bring it up in my initial comments. The slavery was, as you say, underpinning every compromise that was made at the Constitutional Convention. Obviously, the 3/5 clause, which was central to the adoption, the Southern states' willingness to adopt the national legislature, the Congress, that 3/5 clause gave them extra political power for their slaves, who were obviously in bondage, did not have the right to vote, were not citizens, did not have any other human or political rights. They were still counted toward the slave states' political power. The slave states were very insistent on obviously having the 3/5 clause as a condition of passing the Constitution. And then you also have the Senate itself, which treats all states as equal, as sort of a carryover from the Articles of Confederation, in which the states were effectively, different nations in treaty with one another. Both of those features of the design of our national legislature then get imported into the Electoral College, which allocates electors to states based on their representation in Congress. So if a state has extra representatives in Congress because of its slave population, it also has extra electoral votes and therefore more clout in the election of the president. So I think historians, as you said, do in fact debate at length the degree to which slavery itself and the maintenance of slavery and the protection of the interests of slave states, what role that played in the adoption of the way we choose our president. But I do think it is indisputable that immediately the fact of slavery and the fact that the deals struck at the convention gave slave states extra power played out through all the parts of our federal government and its design for the next 80 years for sure. And I argue even up until today, you can see the echoes of racial subjugation and of racial discrimination playing out in the way we choose our president. But fundamentally, slavery is at the heart of all of these compromises, and I just don't think we can ever separate it from the way that our country was built to function and the way that our country functions today.
In fact, I think you make the point in your book, if I recall, I'll probably get the number slightly wrong, that 12 of the first 15 presidents were from the South, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe 36, in the first 40 years of the country's life, 36 of those years, the president was a Virginia slaveholder. I think there's good evidence that at least in 1800, Thomas Jefferson won the election of 1800 only with the help of 18 extra electoral votes that he got out of the South, which the South had because of its slaves. In other words, the South would have had roughly 16 to 18 fewer electoral votes without its slaves, and those votes are the ones that put Jefferson over the top. So the very fact of who became president in this country is very much a function of who was being held, who was being enslaved in which states, and how that translated into political power for those states.
I appreciate that point, because it's one of those moments where you say, obviously, if you look at presidents individually, you understand where each comes from. But I appreciate your showing new light on for me at least, on how regional that was in particular. Tara, please tell us, does the story of slavery inject itself into your narrative of the Electoral College?
No, it doesn't. I would probably just start out by noting, look, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison became president because they were the father of the country, the father of the Constitution, and the author of the Declaration of Independence. They didn't become president because they hailed from Virginia and the slaves, gave them some kind of extra push. They were well known and well regarded, and they had served the country for a long time. And that's why that happened. Look, the slavery discussion has come up a lot in recent years, and I would argue that a lot of it just has to do with demonizing the Electoral College, because how would we want to keep anything, obviously, with roots in slavery? If you look at the discussions that occurred in the Constitutional Convention about the presidential election, it's not there. Discussion of slavery is not there. What you see over and over again is a divide between large state and small state. And they are discussing the balance of power between large and small. They aren't discussing the balance of power between slave and not slave. In fact, if you look at the large states, you see delegates who were slave owners, but you see delegates who weren't, or who didn't even like the institution of slavery. And the opposite, on the small state side, you see both slave owners and people who are working against slavery. And in fact, one memorable quote came from a small state delegate from Delaware who worked against slavery in his lifetime. But he looked at the large state delegates and he said, "Gentlemen, I do not trust you. If you have the power, the abuse of it could not be checked, and you would exercise it to our destruction." And that was the sentiment that drove the small state delegates when they were talking about how to elect a president. And that was a discussion that occurred throughout the Constitution. Obviously, I disagree with the assessment that it was just slapped together at the end. It was a discussion that went on, and they took it very seriously because they knew that this is the one person expected to represent everybody. They would have said, in the big country of 13 states, we have to figure out how to reflect all these different interests in this one person. If anything, that has become even more important. We're bigger and more diverse than we were at the founding. I guess just to wrap up a few points, look, the 3/5 compromise, the South gets painted evil in that, I guess, but the North wasn't exactly innocent. I mean, the North did not want to count slaves at all, and the South wanted to count slaves as one person. And so, I mean, they went back and forth on that. And in the end, a compromise was brokered, basically where the essence of the compromise was the North said, well, you have slightly less representation in Congress, but you'll also pay slightly less in taxes, because the numbers were tied together. And so I would just say, look, this slavery, obviously it's an institution none of us are proud of. We wish it hadn't happened, but there were many authors of the Constitution and many founders at the time that actually thought the Constitution would help bring slavery to an end. And James Madison explicitly stated that in the Federalist Papers and said, look, in the Articles of Confederation, there's literally no way we're going to be able to get rid of this. But with the Constitution, he said, after the year 1808, he thought it would start to go away after that. And that was seen as a good thing. So, look, slavery is something that existed at the time. It was a global problem, not an American problem. And my perspective is that we should be proud of our country, because even at the founding, there were delegates and there were founders that wanted to figure out how to get past this. And they knew they couldn't do all of the steps all in one motion, all in 1 year. They knew it'd be a process, but they started the process. And every generation since then has done better and better and moved the ball further and further down the court. And that is something we should be proud of.
No doubt.
Can I just respond briefly to that? So, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to spend the whole time here on talking about slavery. I do think it's a central part of this story, but I also want to talk about what's happening now and how the Electoral College, as it operates today, serves to corrode American democracy, and my arguments for how I think we could have a better system of electing our leader. But I do want to push back. There's things that Tara said that are just factually untrue, and I need to push back. I'm sorry, Tara, for saying this, but I mean, I will read you quotes from my book, which are drawn directly from the debates in the Constitutional Convention. You are right that the founders argued over this for months. They did take it I agree with you, they took it very seriously. When I say slap together at the end, I don't mean they didn't care about it. What I meant is, they were rushing to get this thing done, and they adopted something that everyone could finally agree on in the last days of the Constitution. It was literally part of what was called the Committee on Unfinished Parts. They had left this until the very end because nobody could agree on how to do it. I will also agree with Tara that there were founders who believed that they were designing an instrument, a charter that might in the future be able to allow for the elimination of slavery. They did say this. I agree with you about that. But here's where I disagree. Tara said it wasn't about the debate wasn't about slave states versus non-slave states. It was about big and small. There were debates between big and small, and that was one of the things that led to the creation of the Senate. But let me just read to you. I'm just going to read to you. These are quotes from James Madison. Okay, James Madison says in July at the Constitutional Convention, the states were, this is a quote, the states were divided into different interests, not by their difference of size, but by other circumstances, the most material of which resulted partly from climate, but principally from the effects of their having or not having slaves. And then further on, Madison says a couple days later, July 19th, he says, I would prefer a direct vote among the people for the president. and he says it, he would produce the most fittest, it would produce the fittest leader of the country. He says, there was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature regarding a popular vote. Quote, the right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. What he means there is that the southern states were getting to count in a system in which you could have power through the 3/5 clause, that extra, I would argue, unearned power on the backs of your slaves. In a popular vote, those slaves wouldn't count at all. So the southern states would suddenly have a much smaller voting population and much less power in the election of the president. Madison is explicit about this. He says this in multiple ways at multiple times in the convention. So contrary to the argument that this was just a big small state thing, no, I think as James Madison, the father of the Constitution, says multiple times, this was the dividing line at the Constitutional Convention was between the slave states and the non-slave states. And it goes right up into the early 19th century when Thomas Jefferson wins that 1800 election. This is no secret. This is not some liberal revisionist history that I'm writing 200 years later. They were saying it at the time. They said, the Mercury and New England Palladium, a Boston newspaper, said that Jefferson had gotten into the White House. He had made his ride into the Temple of Liberty on the shoulders of slaves. And I just think that it's just indisputable that slavery was at the center of the Constitutional Convention. Many of the founders were themselves slaveholders. I recognize they were men of their time. Nevertheless, not everyone was a slaveholder. And I do think it's really important that we never forget as I think Tara rightly put it, how could we continue to live with a system that was born out of slavery? I think that's a great question. And I really think it's one we have to grapple with going forward.
So let me be clear, as a historian, I'd be more than happy to spend the entire hour in the 1780s. I suspect everyone else would rather get to a more contemporary discussion. But Tara, would you like the opportunity to respond to Jesse's points?
I was going to say, you can't let me not respond to that. Look, I agree that there was discussion about slavery when it came to how the population was going to be represented in the House of Representatives. Of course, there was some discussion of that. It wasn't the only discussion, but there was some discussion of that. That quote that Jesse just cited from James Madison, that quote is used often, but it is taken out of context. It was an off-the-cuff remark in that day. What they were really talking about was separation of powers and whether the president should be re-electable, or if they had legislative selection, would that give the legislature too much power over the president if he could be elected for a second term? And that was the discussion. I mean, that quote is pulled out, and they noticed that Madison talked about electors, but it was not the main point. He's mostly that day talking about separation of powers. And by the way, other people discussed electors that day, even before James Madison did. And they were people that were working against slavery. So look, I'm going to go back to, if you read the whole thing and you just read the notes of the Constitutional Convention instead of just picking out convenient quotes here and there, what you see is delegates grappling with how do you balance power between large states and small states? How do you make sure that everybody is represented? You see small states like Delaware and Connecticut, and they are worried. They are very, very worried that they will be tyrannized in the system. And by the way, they would not have agreed to any system that relied upon a simple democracy kind of idea where they could just be outvoted time and time again. And so I think an honest reading of the full notes of the convention, that's what you see.
Okay, let me I'm going to put the same question to both of you. And then in a moment, I'm going to ask each of you to put one direct question to the other before I turn to the growing list of questions from our audience. The question for each of you is, what point would you like to drive forward and emphasize within your argument? I mean, Tara, for example, you don't have to take this, but you talked about coalition building. I'd love to hear more about coalition building. Jesse, you mentioned that you had solutions for how to change things. I'd love to hear what those would be. I think it is Tara's turn to go first, if I'm not mistaken. So Tara, what should we be thinking even more about specifically within your argument?
Well, maybe you mentioned coalition building, so maybe I'll just talk more about, because I gave it it was too brief the first time, the discussion about the Civil War and what we're doing, what happened then and what's happening now, because I do think that there are striking parallels between the two. During those years after the Civil War, if you look at the election maps, you see very similar divides over and over again. The Democrats were strong in the South, of course, but they also did not have enough electoral votes in the South to win the presidency. They simply could not get it done. By contrast, the Republicans had most of their strength in the North and the Northwest, and they were in the kind of in the opposite situation. They had enough electors to win the election, but kind of just barely. And if they lost anything to the Democrats at all, then they were going to lose the White House. So people are stubborn. We spend a lot of time discussing how people are imperfect and don't always do the right thing the first time, but people are stubborn. And so that election cycle did persist for a little while. But what eventually happened is because of the incentives in the system, it was unproductive to stay there. Democrats had to figure out how to reach a hand across the aisle. Republicans had to figure out the same thing because otherwise they would end up losing to a healthier Democratic Party. And so over time, what you see is that the parties got better. The anger and division was overcome to some degree. Probably never completely goes away, but it was overcome to some degree. And by the early 1900s, you had presidents like Calvin Coolidge and FDR winning in landslides. Now, I would say that we are in the same place today. We have two broken political parties. Both of them are broken. Neither one of them is doing a good job of coalition building. They are both catering to their bases. They are both so busy pointing fingers at the other side that they are forgetting that they need to look inward and see what they too are doing wrong. And the only reason we're having these close elections over and over again is because so far the political parties have not done what they are supposed to do. And it's really honestly up to we, the voters, to push them and to make them do it. But I would argue, again, that if we get rid of the Electoral College at this moment in time, we might as well say we want to stay in this angry place forever, as opposed to letting the Electoral College do what it does and incentivize us to work across regional and state and other lines that might normally divide us, to build coalitions, to figure out what do we have in common as Americans? Not what can we blame the other person for, but what do we have in common? What do we have that's similar? What brings us together? And that is historically what the Electoral College has done for us. A national popular vote, I think we could see quite easily how we'd go in a different direction pretty fast. You only have to look as far as the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton, she got 20% of her vote. She won the popular vote, but she got 20% of it from only 2 states. And that is not a healthy dynamic. And in fact, if you take those 2 states out of the equation, Donald Trump was winning by about 3 million votes. Now, she could have fixed that, by the way, very easily. All she had to do was pay attention to a few blue wall states that she took for granted because they've been voting blue for so long. She didn't think she had to work so hard to get them. If she had just spent a little bit of time, the election was hers for the taking. That was all she had to do. But it goes back to, don't become over-reliant on one type of voter. Don't become over-reliant on one region or a handful of big cities. Work hard to understand as many Americans as you can. That's what the Electoral College does for us and what it will continue to do for us if we leave it standing.
Thank you. I really appreciate the point that you make that we oftentimes talk about the Republican Party being the party that's in crisis, but historically, whenever one party implodes, the other party goes down with it. And I think it's very likely we're going to see both parties in crisis, even more so than we're seeing today. Jesse, if you wouldn't mind, what are the solutions that you would offer then as a critic of the Electoral College? How should we fix it?
Sure. I mean, I'll briefly respond to a couple of points here. In terms of what I consider to be the most important point, and I think that leads naturally into the solution. Tara made this comment that I hear often, well, if you just took out those 2 states, Hillary Clinton's popular vote victory disappears and Donald Trump wins by 3 million votes. Well, okay, I mean, I guess if you took off my legs, I would weigh 150 pounds. But, we're one country. Everybody lives here. People live where they live, and that has been changing over history. And when you are electing the leader of the entire country, not a governor for a state, not a state lawmaker, not a senator, not a House of Representatives member, but the president, the one person whose job it is to govern all Americans equally, no matter where they live, I think that all voters, no matter where they live, should count equally in the vote for that office. And I think what the Electoral College does under the winner-take-all rule, which I've mentioned already, that's so corrosive, is that, to the contrary, Tara said that The Electoral College is what brings us together and allows for coalition building. I would argue the exact opposite. It is the Electoral College under the winner-take-all rule that actually divides us and makes us think of ourselves as a nation separated inextricably into red and blue states. So we talk constantly about a red state, a blue state, and it just creates this extremely false image that somehow Texas is a red state, which means, what does that mean? There are no Democrats in Texas? California's a blue state. Wait, there are no Republicans in California? 4.5 million people in California voted for Donald Trump in 2016. You know, none of those people counted when the actual election was held, the electoral vote, the electors casting their votes, because California uses the winner-take-all rule and sent all 55 of its electors to Hillary Clinton, even though Donald Trump won around 40+% of the vote in that state. Those voters disappeared in the election. Same thing happens to Democrats in so-called red states. And you know, a big point of my book, a central argument in my book, is that we're all purple states. Democrats and Republicans are mashed together everywhere, all over the country. And nobody votes based on the state they live in. That's really the crucial point. Nobody votes. Nobody cares what state they live in when they vote. They care about which party they support. Do you care whether your state gave its electors to the Democrat or the Republican? No, you care who becomes president, because that's really what people care about. And so that leads inexorably, I think, to the solution that is most plausible today, which is this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. I write about this in chapter 7 of my book. It was started about 15 years ago by a man that Tara knows well, John Koza. He's a computer scientist living in California who came up with this or built on some previous iterations of the idea back in the early 2000s after the first split election of our lifetimes when George W. Bush won the White House despite losing the popular vote. And basically what it does is it uses the Electoral College as it is currently designed in the Constitution, which is to say it gives states the power to award their electors however they want. I've made this point before, but I'm just going to make it again. States can choose to award their electors however they like. The fact that 48 of 50 states give their electors in a winner-take-all basis is purely a function of state lawmakers deciding to do it that way. And what this compact is an agreement among states who join it to award their electors not to the winner of their popular vote, of the popular vote in their state, but to the winner of the popular vote in all 50 states combined, plus District of Columbia. And when enough states join that compact, meaning states representing a majority of electoral votes, right now that's 270 electoral votes, that's what you need to become president. When states representing 270 electoral votes join this compact, it automatically takes effect. And that way, the president is always the person who won the most votes in the country. And I think, you know, they're now at 196 electoral votes worth of states have joined the compact. So there's only 74 to go. I think it's going to be a big lift to get those last 74. I have no illusions about that. But I do think it is a way to kind of bridge the gap to get to an effective popular vote for president without actually abolishing the Electoral College from the Constitution.
Tara, actually, this question of split electors, of how states choose to allocate their electors, is actually our #1 trending question among the audience. Jesse obviously just gave his thoughts on this. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on how you believe states should allocate their electors.
Sure. There's also a lot to respond to in everything Jesse just said.
Yeah, please go ahead with that too.
You know, I was thinking when he was talking about, I think there's this assumption that if we get rid of the Electoral College, we'll still have these very stable elections where some candidate gets a majority or near a majority, 48, 49% of the popular vote. And it's just and that's more fair because, you know, you have two candidates and the one who gets the most wins. That's not what's going to happen. If you want to see what's going to happen, you need to look only as far as France, where they have 10 to 12 candidates in the election. Because once you take away the Electoral College and the winner-take-all system that Jesse hates, you end up in a situation where the two-party system also becomes very unstable. Well, I don't agree with everything you've said about Madison either. He was not down on the Electoral College. He was down on the contingent election. And that is a totally different animal than being down on the Electoral College. He did prefer district allocation of electors, I think, towards the end. But he, you know, also, though, we've created a system where states have a lot of power to do what they want to do. We have forgotten that. You know, I was talking about how we're angry and divided now. I honestly think this is another reason why we're so angry and divided. We have forgotten that this is an election conducted by states. The states are in charge. The national government's not in charge. The national political parties are not in charge. The national polling agencies are not in charge. The mainstream media is not in charge. We have deferred, we have abdicated responsibility to all of these national entities. And then we act as if they're in charge of making the decision and telling us who our choices are and all sorts of stuff. They're not in charge. The states are in charge. At its heart, the Electoral College is about 51, because there's an election in DC. So 50 states plus DC each conduct their own internal election. They are entirely responsible for that election. They can do what they want to do. And as a matter of history, states have made all sorts of different decisions to support what they want to do. In 1876, Colorado did not hold an election because it lacked money. They had just joined the Union, and it was logistically difficult and financially irresponsible to hold an election for president that year. So they had the state legislature do it. The state legislature just directly appointed electors. In 1892, Wyoming decided it was going to let women vote. They didn't wait around for New York to give them permission. They just did it because Wyoming wanted to encourage women to come to the frontier because they had too many men. So it served their interest. And so that's what they did. If you look at other elections, there are elections where in 1836, Virginia couldn't stand the vice presidential candidate. They thought he was just awful. He was living with his slave. I actually feel kind of sorry for him. So he wanted to marry the slave and he wasn't allowed to. But nevertheless, Virginia hated that. They couldn't stand it. And so they did not put him on the ballot. He was not on, they nominated some other vice presidential candidate that they could live with. And if you look through history, you see this kind of state independence over and over and over again. So I would argue the opposite of everything Jesse is saying. Our problem isn't that we've failed to get rid of the Electoral College. Our problem is that we have forgotten how the Electoral College operates. We have forgotten that this is about states being a check in the system. I talked about checks and balances. States are checks on each other and checks on national forces. And the further we drift away from this idea of state independence and state power, responsibilities, the more angry and divided we become. Well, maybe that's not surprising because it's a huge, big, diverse country, and one-size-fits-all solutions never work in a country as big and diverse as America. And the state-by-state presidential election process was one of the tools that our founders gave to combat this kind of idea that we have to all figure out how to agree on anything in this country, because clearly we can't do it. And to go back to the idea of a president, that yes, this is the only president or the only elected official in our country with this kind of a unique election process, but he is also, or she someday, is the only person that is expected to represent all of us in this huge diverse country with different industries and different subcultures and different regions and climates and priorities. And so I think it's great that this election process is unique and different from all the others.
Jeff, I know you have a lot of questions to tap and I want you to get to them, but I just want to, can I ask Tara one question?
Please.
Tara,
Tara, you're going to get the same chance in a second.
You just said that you really value this, that this is a state-based process, and I agree with you. The Electoral College is designed primarily with the control resting in the states. If that's true and that's really what you value, do you what problems, if any, do you have with the popular vote compact, which is, after all, states deciding among themselves to use to allocate their electors in a specific way?
So that would have a lot more to say for it if they were doing it without the compact, okay? If California believes that it's in California's best interest to give its electors to the winner of the national popular vote, then California should do that right now. Without any compact, it should not need all of the other states to jump into this with them. But California does not think that it's in California's best interest to give its electors to the winner of the popular vote. They have no interest in giving their electors to Bush, when he defeats Kerry. That's not something they're interested in. What they are interested in is they are interested in changing the presidential election process itself. And that's why they need the contract, because without other states joining them, they can't get that done, which of course makes it look like an end run around Article 5 of the Constitution, which requires 3/4 of the states before you can make that kind of a change. So this isn't about a state acting on its own to protect the state. It's about a state wanting to get together with a minority of other states and change the presidential election process, even though that's not allowed under our Constitution.
Tara, what would you like to put to Jesse?
So since we're talking about the national popular vote, and I need to give a quick explanation before I ask my question, and Jesse, I'm sure he knows this, but for everybody else, Look, under the National Popular Vote Compact, because it's not a constitutional amendment, all of the existing state laws will still stay in place, okay? So right now, I said we have 51 different elections. In Texas, we have one set of laws. Oklahoma next door has a different set of laws. We have different ways to get on the ballot. We have different ways to early vote. We have a different way of getting an absentee ballot, you know, voting hours, whatever. Name your issue. There's different laws in Oklahoma and Texas. Okay, right now it doesn't matter because in Texas, we are casting our ballot in a statewide election for presidential elector, and a vote cast in Oklahoma has no effect on that. So we don't care what Oklahoma does because they're not going to change the identity of a Texas elector. With the national popular vote in place, we will have 51 different sets of laws, different sets of early voting rules, different sets of whether felons can vote or not vote. I mean, again, name your issue, how to count a hanging chad. We'll have all of these different rules governing one election, because then we're going to say that we can take all of these votes and put them into one pool. And a vote cast in California, or I should say Texas hasn't joined the compact, so we'll say a vote cast in Texas can change the identity of an elector in California. So Jesse, my question to you is, why is it fair? Why is that fair? What if in Texas we get 3 weeks of early voting time and in California they get 1 week of early voting time? Why is that fair to those voters in California that they have to then give their electors to someone that maybe Texas picked because we had more time to early vote? And the second part of that question is, what's going to prevent a race to the bottom once states realize that this is how this works? And what's to stop California from saying, well, if Texas gets 3 weeks to vote, now we have 5? And what is to stop these kinds of dynamics?
I guess I don't see it as a race to the bottom. I see it as a race to the top. I don't think our problem is right now that voting is too easy. I think it's that voting is too hard. And I would be happy to have any pressure placed on states that currently make voting harder to join their other brother and sister states to make voting easier. But you know, another answer to your question is, we do this right now. We pool together electoral votes from all 50 states, which have different standards and different rules of different election laws. You mentioned felon disenfranchisement. Those election laws can literally alter the outcome of the state, which way the state sends its electors. 2000 is a perfect example. Florida gave all of its electoral votes to George W. Bush, arguably because of their felon disenfranchisement laws, which kept thousands and thousands of otherwise eligible voters off the rolls accidentally, quote unquote, and let George W. Bush win by 537 votes. So in fact, right now, the entire country is beholden to all states' electoral laws through the mechanism of the Electoral College and the electoral votes. So I don't see how it's any different to do so in a popular vote election than it is through the system that we have right now.
One of the authors of the National Popular Vote Compact, Vik Amar, says that this is a huge problem and that it will create equal protection problems potentially. It's if Californians have less time to vote than Texans, like I'm losing my sorry, if Californians have less time to vote than Texans, then that's a huge big problem. That and it's going to result in lawsuits. It's going to result in problems. And Vik Amar said the only way you can resolve this is to create a federal election code where everybody is operating under the same set of rules. And so, in fact, this is the most basic rule of democracy, is that every voter in the same voting pool should be operating under the same rules. Otherwise, somebody is being treated unequally and unfairly. Why is it okay for voters to be treated unequally and unfairly under the National Popular Vote Compact?
I have no problem with a federal standard for voting for the presidency.
But that's not what the compact does not create authority for that to happen.
I'm just responding to your saying that would be needed. I would be fine with that.
Well, and certainly.
Okay, so you need a constitutional amendment to make that happen, because otherwise the Congress doesn't have the ability to make that happen. So you're not advocating for the National Popular Vote Compact. You're advocating for a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, which is a much harder thing to achieve.
I would be fine with either one.
Well,
great. I'm happy that we're getting rid of the compact.
Well, I guess this does bring up a broader issue, which has been bothering me throughout this entire conversation, which is you're both making extraordinarily eloquent arguments, but perhaps about the wrong thing. That the Electoral College is an issue for our country once every 4 years. The Senate is an anti-democratic institution every day of every year, or at least when it's in session. I mean, to ask why it is that some boundaries that were drawn by British surveyors in 1640 should determine how many votes an area gets is a very curious, archaic way of doing things. Now, it is the Constitution. It would require change. But it strikes me that the entire conversation that we're having could be refocused, take out the word Electoral College and put in Senate.
I don't think, no, I would respectfully disagree with that. Obviously, the Senate is an anti-democratic institution. It was designed that way. It was designed to represent the states as states in the Union, in contrast to the House of Representatives, which was meant to be based on population. There's a whole separate conversation we could have about the fact that the House of Representatives no longer represents the country based on population because it's been locked at its size, 435 members for the last 110 years, but that's a different debate. You're right that the Senate is designed that way, and you're right that there was a huge amount of pushback at the Constitutional Convention by the delegates of the larger states in particular, who were horrified at the idea that a state that was 1/6 the size of their state would have the same power in the national legislature, or at least in one branch of the national legislature. Just for comparison's sake, it's now that the difference between the biggest and the small state is not 6 to 1, it's 70 to 1. So I shudder to think what the founders would say if they saw the country today. Nevertheless, the reason you can't just substitute Senate for Electoral College in this debate is a very fundamental one, which is that the Electoral College could be amended out of the Constitution. It's been debated, it nearly happened in 1970, but the Senate effectively cannot. The Senate, by the Constitution's own terms, is effectively unamendable. So we are stuck with the Senate. I agree, I don't like it as an institution. I think it's anti-democratic, and I think it harms policymaking on a national level. And I think it basically prevents us from adopting policies that most Americans want. But there's nothing that can be done about the existence of the Senate. And so that's why I think focusing on the Electoral College is a more fruitful avenue.
Tara?
Well, look, I agree you could substitute the Senate. I mean, Jesse's right. It's much harder to get rid of the Senate because you have to get every single state to agree, and that's not going to happen. But otherwise, you could insert the Senate into this. But I would say, look, the reasons we have the Senate and the reasons we have the Electoral College are very similar. It goes back to this concept of checks and balances, and nobody's perfect. Nobody has the corner on the truth. Nobody can be trustworthy all the time. I think that we undermined the Senate a lot, actually, by making it more democratic. So just to horrify everybody, I think we should get rid of the 17th Amendment. I think that undermined us badly. And the reason is because the Senate was never expected to represent the people. It was expected to represent the states as states. And if you think that's not important, it is. I mean, think about things like unfunded state mandates. Those used to be impossible because the senators were accountable to the state legislators who would have had to figure out how to fund that. And so the senators would have just said, no, we're not going to do that because we're protecting our states as states. And if you look at things like the federal budget, you can trace a whole bunch of things back to that moment when we decided we were going to take away the state's ability to protect itself from federal government intrusion. We got rid of a check and balance, and that was a bad thing. And so, look, I think every time we chip away, we just chip away at these Republican small r protections that our founding fathers gave us, and then we're surprised when things don't go so well. And I would say, look, the Electoral College, if we get rid of it, JFK actually once said, he was a big fan of the Electoral College, which people don't always know, but JFK once said, look, it's like a solar system of governmental power. You can't expect to change one thing and to leave everything else unaffected. My analogy, if you change the gravitational pull of the sun, you pull the earth too close and you probably make earth uninhabitable. Change the climate so badly. So you can't just say, I'm going to make this decision in a vacuum and pluck this one little thing out and expect to leave the whole system of checks and balances otherwise like it was. It's not going to happen. So the Electoral College has served us well. If we're upset now that there's discrepancies between the electoral and the popular vote, which I understand, the right answer is for the political parties and for voters to look inward and to figure out what is going wrong and why they are unable to build the coalitions that they need.
You know, we are rapidly coming up on our scheduled time. The Zoom gods have granted me 10 more minutes. If both of you can stay on for an extra 10 minutes,
sure,
that'd be wonderful. So we've already asked the #1 trending question on our list, which was about split electors. The #2 trending question, if I'm doing the rough math right, has been asked about 4 different ways within our list, which is what to do with the potential that if a popular vote were the only determining factor, that presidential candidates would not visit much of the country, at least geographically. Several people have asked this question in various and sundry ways, including wondering if presidential candidates would care at all about much of the country. I'm curious how each of you might respond to that question. I believe it is Jesse's turn to go first.
Sure. So, this is one of the most common concerns that's expressed when we talk about a popular vote election. I mean, the first point I guess I have to make is that this is the reality right now. If that concerns you, you should be concerned very much about the way that the Electoral College, under the winner-take-all rule, incentivizes presidential candidates of both parties to behave. Right now, because of the winner-take-all rule, the presidential campaigns for both parties focus virtually all of their attention, their money, their advertising, their policy platforms at a small handful of what we call battleground states. And that's because those are the only states that matter in a presidential election. They're the only states that all of that attention could actually make a difference in, because you can move a few thousand votes with campaigning, with advertising, with the sorts of policy preferences that campaigns and presidents focus on. And if you can move those few thousand votes and win 10, 20, 30 electors in the process, you're going to do it. That means that 95% or more of all political events and political money and advertising goes into about 5 or 6 states every 4 years. The other 40 to 45 states are effectively invisible. They don't matter to the candidates of either party. Their interests, their policy interests don't get any attention. And presidents, once they're in office, also pay more attention to those battleground states and lavish more money on them, more federal emergency grants. There's all kinds of studies showing how presidents of both parties, Barack Obama did this too. And it's because that's what's the incentive. Now, the other question is, what would candidates do in a popular vote election? I finished my book, Chapter 9, is a series of interviews with campaign managers and field directors of both parties who've run presidential campaigns for the last 25 years. And all of them say it just goes completely against the whole notion of how campaigning happens to imagine that somehow all of the campaigning and all of the money and all the attention would be focused on the big population areas. In fact, those areas couldn't come close to deciding the outcome of the election. Yes, there are lots of people there, and yes, they want both parties want as many of those votes as they can get. They also want the votes in the suburbs and in the exurbs and in the small towns and in the rural areas. And when you look at campaigns that actually happen like say on a statewide level, a gubernatorial campaign, Tara used the example of France to say what would go wrong, but actually I think we have an example closer to home, which is more useful and more apt, which is our gubernatorial elections. Those are the closest proxy I'd say that we have for a national popular vote. And in those elections, the candidates go everywhere in their state, even to places where they know they're not going to win because they want to lose those places by less, win as many votes overall as possible, and then win the election, because those elections are elections in which all votes count the same and the person who wins the most votes wins. That to me is the basic fundamental rule for all of our elections, majority rule, political equality, and it should apply to the presidency just as it does to every other election in the country.
Well, I would argue that if you talk to rural voters in New York, they're going to disagree with that assessment. They do not feel like they're represented by the statewide offices in New York. They feel like New York City drives the election. To go back to the
New York City residents would disagree with that. I can tell you as a New York City resident, New York City residents experience a huge amount of emphasis on the rural areas at their own expense. So I think that it goes both ways, that there's a lot of feeling that people aren't represented.
I think we can all agree that everyone feels underrepresented as a general principle of life. But I've never met anybody who thinks that they are actually getting their voice heard enough. But Tara, to your point.
Well, I was going to say, if you look at the distribution of votes and who's getting represented, not just in New York, but in California and in Pennsylvania and a handful of states like that. I mean, I can't tell you how often a rural small city voter comes to me and says, I'm not represented in my state government. And I think we would take that dynamic and we would remove it from the state level and move it up to the national level. And that there's no good that can come of that. To go back to the safe state versus swing state thing, I completely disagree with all of that. Safe states matter. Okay, they matter a lot. There is no Democrat that wants to go into an election without California in its back pocket. Those 55 electoral votes are very valuable to Democrats, just like Texas 38 votes are very, very valuable to Republicans. And the difference, the main difference between a safe state and a swing state is that a safe state made up its mind a lot earlier in the process. And it made up its mind based on the 4 years of governance that preceded the election and whether they generally are or aren't happy with what's going on. And when they change their minds, by the way, they're really quick to let people know, which is why there's a bunch of Southern states that voted for Bill Clinton and haven't voted Democrat ever since, or why Texas used to be Democrat and now some people are starting to worry that it's gonna go purple, or why California used to vote Republican, but now it's really, really safe blue. And in fact, if you look at the history of states voting, you see that these things they fluctuate, they change. And so at the end of the day, every political party, every candidate, they can't take a part of the country for granted. They can't take a state. It's not fruitful. In 2000, George Bush, we pay so much attention to Florida and what happened to Florida that year. And obviously that, that was important. But what was also extremely important was that George W. Bush flipped the really safe blue state of West Virginia. It hadn't voted, it was very solid Democratic state. The party had been ignoring it because the environmental issues left West Virginia out in the cold. And so they switched and they've been safe red ever since. Or you can look at an example like 2016, Utah, unhappy with Clinton, unhappy with Trump, didn't like either one of them, threatening to vote third party. And so, the Republican Party didn't say, oh, well, they're our safe state, it's fine, it'll be fine. And they're little, it'll be fine. No, they took it really, really seriously. And in fact, Utah got a visit from Mike Pence in the closing days of the campaign because the Republican Party knew it could not take the safe little red state of Utah for granted. And if you look at the full history of states voting and what's happening, you see that this is productive behavior. It is productive for political parties to pay attention to all of their states, because at the end of the day, you cannot get to 270 with only the electoral votes in the battleground states. There simply are not enough. So you've got to figure out how to keep your safe states happy too.
Well, I think there's an interesting dynamic that plays out in the current situation, certainly, where we know that both campaigns are going to spend more media dollars in the most competitive states. And I have to say, as someone who's been in a non-competitive state for many years, it's nice not to be inundated with those commercials. Visiting friends who are in those states, you don't want to turn on the TV, which has its own advantages. So let me ask this as a final question, and please feel free to take this in the direction of your choice. But we certainly have had a wonderful discussion here about the Electoral College. But to be honest, the Electoral College is not the only thing that people are worrying about, shall I say, for this next election. There seems to be an increasing trend, and please feel free to disagree with me on this, but I sense an increasing trend to question the legitimacy of the election process in the country in a way that I have not seen, I guess not personally, but I would not say it was the case since 1861, 1860, actually, a better example. And so I'm just curious, as you look at this entire election coming forward, what are you thinking about? What are you worrying about? And is the Electoral College it? Jesse, I think you're up first. No, wait, Tara, you're up first. Tara, you're up first.
Look, I don't like it. I don't like these series of close elections. I don't like the discontent. But I tend to think that the problem, look, if the system is otherwise fundamentally good, which I think it is, you don't fix that discontent problem by getting rid of something that's good. You fix the problem with education. And let's talk about it. Let's talk about why we have this. Let's talk about what the goals are. Let's talk about how it serves us. So, and again, I'm going to go back to, not to be a broken record or anything, but I think both parties are broken. I think that they're both being really stubborn. And I don't like the attitude of, well, I couldn't win under that system, so let me change it. We just need to, both parties, and by the way, this is, I don't know how it's coming off. It's not a dig at either party in particular. Whichever party fixes itself first, the other party will get motivated to fix itself because it will have to compete well. Iron sharpens iron. And so I honestly, to some degree, don't even care which party fixes itself first. Just one of you do it, please. So we can get out of this ugly place. So to me, the solution to any of this is just education and a willingness to be honest and to look inward and to figure out what we need to do. And I do think this comes back to voters, and voters making, if you feel an allegiance to one party over the other, you need to get your party in line. Both of you, all of you, fix it. This is up to us.
Jesse?
I'll say quickly on your question, you know, I think when the President of the United States is hawking conspiracy theories about the rigging of the election from before he was elected until today, I think that is a hugely destructive force in American politics and society. And that to me is the biggest concern, is that the president himself is claiming that we are going to have a rigged election, or that it's a fraudulent election, that if he doesn't win it. That's my biggest concern about November, even more, I think, than the Electoral College. I will just say finally, though, that, you know, Tara began this whole conversation, I think, with a good emphasis on human frailty and human fallibility. And I want to bring it back to that and say, you know, the founders were trying out something that had never been tried before. They did a lot of things right. They did a lot of things wrong. They were slaveholders. They believed it was okay to own other people. They believed that women were not full citizens who could vote. They believed that poor white people couldn't vote. And at every point in our history where we've had an opportunity to fix the inequities that the founders embedded in our constitutional structure, we have done so. We have abolished slavery. We have given women the vote. We have given poor white people the vote. We have essentially made for universal suffrage, with a few exceptions, felon disenfranchisement being one of them. And I think the popular vote of the president is really the next step on that arc of democratization and of creating a political equality that matches the moment and that matches the words of the Declaration of Independence, that all of us are created equal. I think the founders understood that, even if they couldn't live up to it themselves. We have an opportunity to live up to it. And I think that electing the president by a popular vote in which all people count, all people matter, and all of us are treated equal, I think is the next and most important step we can make toward a truly representative democracy.
Thank you. Let me just say, just my quick thanks to both of you. I hope that you have the sense you're able to get your points across as you wanted. I know that everyone watching has the great sense that this was a marvelous and enlightening conversation. So my thanks to you, and I'll turn it over to our host.
Yes, thank you guys so much for being with us today. And I hate we had to end the conversation, and I wish we could have gotten to all the many questions that our audience members had. But I'd like to take this time to encourage them again to go to Interabang and purchase copies of all of y'all's books. Again, the 10% discount if you use the code word dfwworld. I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors that help make these events possible. We truly appreciate your support. So thank you guys very much. And then I'd also like to encourage everybody to go to our website and check out some upcoming events. Jesse, Tara, thank you very much for being with us. And Jeff, thank you very much for moderating this conversation. We appreciate it.